really quick in a paragraph, what Great Expectations is about. Graveyards, poverty, prison ships, chains, fights to the death, love and rejection, the eventual triumph of good over evil. Orphan Pip discovers through lawyer Mr. Jaggers that a mysterious benefactor wishes to ensure that he becomes a gentleman. Reunited with his childhood patron, Miss Havisham, and his first love, the beautiful but emotionally cold Estella, he discovers that the elderly spinster has gone mad from being left at the altar as a young woman and has changed Estella into a warped, unfeeling heartbreaker. Chapter 1, Meeting by a Grave. Though I lived most of my early years here in Kent, its marshes can still frighten me. The mists make figures, and strange sounds carry over the river close by. It was no different that one Christmas Eve, when I was 7 years old. I was visiting my parents' grave in the churchyard on the deserted marshes. Now, I never really knew my parents, so I could only read their names on the tombstones. Philip and Georgiana Pirup. Philip is my name, too. When I was learning to talk, I guess I could not pronounce it, so I made it into Pip, which is the name I came to be called for the rest of my life. As I tried desperately to remember my parents, I began to cry. Suddenly, a frightening voice cried out, "Stop your noise, or I'll cut your throat, boy!" And the huge man appeared from among the graves and seized my chin in a steely grip. He was dressed in coarse gray clothes with an iron band clamped around one leg. He was wet and shivering and mud-stained, but his eyes glared brightly at me. I was terror-stricken. Please, sir, don't kill me. Please, don't." "What's your name? Quick! Where do you live? You and your folks?" Pip is my name, sir. My parents are there in those graves, and I live with my only sister, Mrs. Joe Gargery, and her husband, the blacksmith in the village." "Hey! Blacksmith, is it?" And he looked down at his leg. In one motion, he turned me upside down and he emptied my pockets. A few nails and a piece of bread were all that they contained. Putting me right side up on top of a high tombstone, he crammed his bread in his mouth and he ate it ravenously. "Hey, now, you young villain, I'm deciding if I'll let you live or not." He tilted me backwards. "Do you know what a file is, boy?" I nodded, too frightened to speak as I clung to the tombstone. "Well, you go when you get me a file, and you get me some food, and you bring them here tomorrow morning. Do you understand me, boy?" Swallowing hard and clinging to him as he pushed me even further, I gasped out, Yes, sir." "But you tell anyone, and you're a dead boy, you understand me? Dead! I got a friend who loves cutting the heart out of a boy. A boy may think he's safe in bed, but my friend knows how to sneak into a warm bedroom and find him. You remember what I say, boy? Now go!" I nodded eagerly, and I jumped down and I ran as fast as I could back home. My heart beat so loudly I could hear it. At home, there was more trouble. As I tiptoed into the kitchen, my brother-in-law, Joe, the blacksmith, shook his big blonde head at me. "Pip, where you been? She's been out looking for you." At that moment, the door burst open and my sister stormed in. Let me tell you about Mrs. Joe. Mrs. Joe is 20 years older than me, and she has a hot temper. Without a word, she banged me in the head and she threw me at Joe. Joe stepped in front of me and turned to face my sister as she rushed at me again. She tried to dodge behind Joe, but, well, he's a giant man. He's always kind and gentle. Joe and I turned like the front and back ends of a horse until my sister got tired of chasing me around. Joe smiled at me as soon as the danger was past, and he drew me to the warm fireplace. Above the sound of my sister slamming pots and dishes, I heard a gun in the distance. "What's that, Joe?" I whispered. "Aye, it's a warning gun from the prison ships down on the river. A convict's escaped, Pip. That's the second one. The gun fired last night, too, to warn us that a robber or a murderer was loose." A shiver went through me. My sister banged on the table to indicate her impatience. We hurried to sit down at dinner. She buttered bread for me and Joe, and she handed it out. Now, though Joe was the provider of the bread and butter, he was too good-natured to object to being treated like a child. While my sister complained of the house cleaning she had been doing in preparation for a party the next day, which was Christmas Day, I hid bread in my pocket. In case I couldn't find anything to take from my sister's pantry, I had to be sure to have something to give the convict, you see. Now, since my sister never allowed me a candle to light my way to my attic room, I stumbled in the darkness that night, fearing that I, too, would end up on a prison ship for thieving from my sister's pantry. Once in bed, I imagined a young convict at the foot of my bed, ready to cut out my heart. I kept the bread clutched in my hand all night, ready to show it to him. He did not come, and yet I barely slept. At the first grey light of dawn, I stole downstairs. The creaking steps seemed to call, "Stop, thief!" after me. As it was the holiday season, there was much more food in the pantry than I expected. I took some more bread, a hunk of cheese, a pork pie, and some brandy. I poured the brandy into an empty bottle, and I refilled the bottle with water to make up for what I'd taken. I dared to take the pork pie only because it was on a back shelf, you see, and so I guessed my sister did not intend to serve it soon. "Hello, Talia." A door led from the kitchen to Joe's blacksmith forge. I slipped in and I selected a heavy file from among Joe's tools. With the things I had acquired for the convict hidden under my jacket, I ran for the marshes through the heavy morning mist. Now, I was not too far from the ruined walls where I was to meet my man when I suddenly saw him. He was sitting with his back to me, his head nodding forward in sleep. I approached him softly and I touched him on the shoulder. He jumped up and whirled around. Now you might imagine my astonishment when I saw that it was not the same man. This one was also dressed in grey and wore a leg iron, but his face was different. He swore at me and he aimed a weak blow at my head. He missed me, but the motion made him stumble, so he must have been ill and cold. He ran off into the mist. I felt certain that he was the friend who cut out boys' hearts in the night. At the walls, I saw the right man, stamping up and down to warm himself. When I took the food and the file from under my jacket, his eyes widened. With a shivering hand, he began to cram down the food. When I brought out the bottle, he said, What do you got there, boy, in that bottle?" Brandy, sir. It helps to ward off the chill of the marshes, and I'm thinking you're very cold out here alone. Are you not?" He snatched the bottle from my hand and he drank deeply. Then, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, he said, You're very thoughtful for a boy. You told no one, did you?" No, sir, no one. I stole the food." Nodding with satisfaction, he took large bites of the pork pie till it was almost all gone. I'm glad you're enjoying it, sir, but aren't you leaving any for him?" "Oh, you mean my friend that cuts out boys' hearts, do you? Oh, he won't want any food." "Oh, well, he looked like he might." My words stunned him, and he stopped eating and cried, Look, you saw him! Where? When did you see him?" I spoke hurriedly, for he had grabbed me by the collar and was glaring at me now. He was down there," I stammered and pointed out the direction. He's dressed like you, and he has an iron on his leg. There was a gun fired for him last night. Didn't you hear it?" I thought so. Oh, but then again I didn't. Hey, being alone in these marshes makes you light-headed, you know. What kind of face did he have?" "Well, he had bruises on one cheek." The man drew in his breath with a rasp. So it is him. Oh, I'll hunt that blackguard down like a bloodhound. Where's the file? Give me the file, boy." I picked up the file from the ground where he had thrown it when he grabbed the food. Pushing aside the rest of the pork pie, he seized the file from me. He knelt on the wet grass and began to file at his leg iron like a madman. I said that I had to leave, but he paid no attention to me. I took a few steps backward to see if he would stop me. When he didn't look up, I turned and I slipped quietly away. Then I ran toward home. In the distance, I could still hear the faint sawing sound of him filing on his leg iron. Back at home, my sister was furiously putting up clean white curtains and taking the dust covers off the furniture in the parlor. The room was used only on very special occasions, you see, and, well, Christmas was one of those. Joe and I had to eat breakfast standing because my sister had no time to set a proper table. She'd begun preparing dinner, for guests were expected. Well, my heart My heart fair skipped a beat when I realized that the pork pie might be meant for today's festivities. The terror of my sister's wrath stayed with me as she washed my face and ears with the usual rough hand. I still shiver now a little just thinking of it. Anyway, before long, my sister had both Joe and me in our best clothes and sitting, stiff and uncomfortable, in the parlor. At the first knock on the front door, I opened it wide to admit Mr. Wopsle, the clerk of our church. Now next came Mr. and Mrs. Hubble, the wheelmaker and his wife. Last, in his own small carriage, came Uncle Pumblechook, who was really Joe's uncle, although my sister had taken him over as a relation because he was a well-to-do seed merchant in town. My sister welcomed him warmly. "Oh, Mrs. Joe," said Uncle Pumblechook, "I've brought you some wine as a compliment of the season, and some fine sherry and port, too." Now, Uncle Pumblechook acted as if the gift was a great surprise, but since he brought the same thing every year, it surprised no one. Now, dinner was a gay affair for everyone, well, except me. I was not allowed to speak. Much of the conversation centered on the burden that I was to my poor sister. Joe was not allowed to deny the accusation, but he tried to make it up to me by pouring large quantities of gravy on my meat. Then my sister said, "Uncle Pumblechook, I have made a special favorite of yours, a pork pie." Now, the praise of eager diners followed her as she left for the pantry. I heard her moving about in there, followed by a few moments of utter silence. She returned to us empty-handed, saying, "Goodness gracious, the pork pie is gone." I couldn't stand it any longer. I had to escape. I jumped up from the table and I rushed to the door. As I reached it, it swung open and a party of soldiers entered. I ran blindly into the leader, who called, "Here you are, lad, come on now." And he held a pair of handcuffs out toward me. I stumbled backwards from the soldier, thinking to myself, "They know I'm a thief, and they've come for me. Oh, it's the prison ship for me. I should never have stolen the pork pie. Oh." Fortunately, I kept this quiet and to myself, no matter how fearsome I was. Joe grabbed my arm and kept me from falling. The soldier smiled at me, and then he looked at the gathered company. "Excuse us, ladies and gentlemen. I'm a sergeant in the service of the king. My men and I are on a hunt for convicts and need the services of the blacksmith." "That's the blacksmith," said my sister before Joe could speak. "What do you want with him on Christmas Day, eh?" "Well, we need these handcuffs fixed, ma'am. The lock is out of line. They'll be required soon." My sister motioned Joe forward and examined the cuffs. Well, I'll have to light my forge. The repair may take, an hour or so." "That's all right," said the sergeant. "We have orders to close in around the convicts on the marshes a little before dusk. So forge away, blacksmith." The soldiers entered and stacked their arms in a corner. Then all of them, except for the sergeant, followed Joe, who'd put on his leather apron, into the forge to help speed the work. Now, Uncle Pumblechook invited the sergeant to the table and poured in some of the wine he had brought as a gift. The party became merry again. In the background, we could hear Joe's hammer. In return for the repair of the cuffs, the sergeant gave permission for our group to follow and witness the capture. Only Mr. Wopsle and, Joe accepted. Mrs. Joe let me go, but she warned her husband, "If you bring the boy back with his head blown to bits by a musket, don't look to me to put it together again." We went directly to the churchyard where I had first seen my convict. While the soldiers searched, I began to worry that the convict would think that I had betrayed him. When they found nothing, we moved on. By now, a bitter sleet had begun to pelt us. Suddenly a shout sounded in the distance. With a sweep of his hand, the sergeant commanded his men to run toward it. More shouts came from the same direction. Since I could not keep up with the long strides of the men, Joe swept me onto his broad back and hurried after the soldiers. As we got close to a ditch from which water was splashing and mud was flying, we heard the sergeant shout out, "Surrender, you two! Come apart! Come apart!" The soldiers stood at the top of the ditch, their muskets leveled at two struggling figures. When the men refused to obey, the soldiers dropped into the ditch and dragged them out bloody and panting. My convict was in a in a fair rage as he and the other men were handcuffed. "Remember, I took him! I gave him to you! I did! I gave him to you!" The other convict, the one with the bruised face, was badly battered. The soldiers had to help him to stand. He tried to murder me," the injured man gasped. The convict snorted. "If I tried to murder you, I would have succeeded and you'd be dead. I wanted him alive so I could turn him in. I dragged him back here for you." He pointed to the sergeant and continued, "You don't see an iron on my leg, do you? I could have got clear away, but I wouldn't let him profit by means of my escape. I'd be free to get me in trouble again." "Enough," ordered the sergeant. Torches were lit and guns were fired as a signal to the prison ship to send a boat. In the flickering light of the torches, my convict caught sight of me. I looked at him eagerly. I moved my hand slightly, and I shook my head, trying to assure him that I had not led the soldiers to him. His eyes gazed deeply into mine for a moment with a look that I could not understand. Soon we began the march to the river, where the convicts were taken to the boat. Just before going aboard, my convict stopped and turned to the sergeant. Sergeant, I want to say something. I stole some..." He said this out clearly so all could hear. "I stole some food and brandy from the blacksmith's house in the village. It was a pork pie that I took." Joe said, "Why, my wife just missed the pie before we came out here. We don't begrudge a starving man some food, now do we, Pip?" I shook my head, unable to speak. The convicts stepped into the boat and were rowed to the prison ship. The rest of us went home. Now, my Joe could not read at all. But, well, after all, reading was not required of a blacksmith. I could read a little, and as I was to be apprenticed to Joe when I was old enough, it was plain that I was already educated above my station in life. I wanted nothing more than to be a blacksmith and to work with Joe, whom I loved and who loved me and protected me against my sister's temper, well, as much as he was able. Frequently, Joe's interference in my sister's punishments earned both of us a rapping on the head by my sister's hand. These physical reminders of her wrath were accompanied by fierce scoldings. Now, soon after Christmas, a great change came into my life. Uncle Pumblechook arrived one day with an invitation from Miss Havisham. Miss Havisham, an immensely rich and grim old lady who lived in a big, neglected house. Now, I had never seen the lady, but I had heard about her. She lived a life of seclusion, and her house was barricaded for fear of robbers. Now, apparently, the strange woman wanted me to come and play at her house. Joe was astonished. How could she have come to know about Pip?" he asked Mrs. Joe. "Oh, Noodle!" cried my sister. "Who said she knew him?" She gestured with a smile at Uncle Pumblechook. "Your uncle is her tenant. One day when he was paying his rent, she asked if he knew any boy who could come out and play. Now, out of goodness of his heart, he mentioned this one here." And she pointed at me. "Now get out of my way so I can clean him up." She seized me and soaped and scrubbed and rinsed and toweled me until I shone. Then she brought out fresh underwear and my best suit. As I was undergoing this torture, my sister and Uncle Pumblechook dreamed aloud. She said, "Oh, if only I were a boy befriended by a rich woman. It could be the making of him, Uncle, the making of us all." Uncle Pumblechook nodded gravely. "Oh, no doubt about it, no doubt about it. A fortune may have its eyes on him right now." Now, before I could really take in what was happening to me, I was bundled into Uncle's carriage and on my way. I dared not ask why or what I should play at, and so I sat silently until we drove up to a locked gate surrounding an old, dismal brick house with many walled-up and barred windows. Uncle rang the gate bell. A window was raised, and a clear voice called out, "What name?" Pumblechook, delivering a boy, Pip," my uncle replied. The window slammed closed. After a few moments, a beautiful young girl came across the courtyard to the gate carrying the keys in her hand. She was about my age, but she seemed older because of the proud and haughty way that she held her head and shoulders. She scarcely looked at me, but said, "Come in, Pip," and started to close the gate. When Uncle tried to follow me inside, she stopped him with a sharp, "Did you wish to see Miss Havisham?" Uncle Pumblechook looked uncomfortable. I do, if Miss Havisham wishes to see me.
Ah, she does not.
With that brief refusal, the young girl slammed the gate on my uncle and turned as if he had never been there. Leaving Uncle with his dignity severely ruffled, we crossed the courtyard. We went into the house through a side door, the front one being chained shut. It was dark inside, but the girl had left a candle burning on a table by the door. She led me down several passages and up a staircase, saying scornfully several times, "Don't loiter, boy, or you'll get lost. Don't loiter." Finally, we stopped before a closed door. "Well, go in," she directed me. More out of shyness than politeness, I answered, "After you, miss." "Don't be ridiculous, boy. I'm not going in." And then she walked away, taking the candle with her and leaving me alone in the dark hall. Now, uncomfortable and frightened by what I might encounter on the other side, I knocked on the door. A cracked voice told me to enter. Cautiously passing through the threshold, I found myself in a large room lit with candles. It seemed to be a lady's dressing room, for there was a large gilded mirror sitting atop a draped table. Dresses were scattered about on half-packed trunks. In the midst of this chaos sat the strangest lady that I had ever seen. She was dressed entirely in white, silk, satin, and lace. She wore a bridal gown. A long white bridal veil streamed from her hair, which was white as well. Only one of her white shoes was on her feet. The other lay on a table nearby. White gloves, a white lace handkerchief with a white prayer book lay on her dressing table. Now, understand, please, as I say all these things were white, the truth is they had been white one time when they were new, but they were now quite yellow with age. Age had also changed the figure in the wedding dress, for it was clear that the dress had been made for a young woman and hung loose on the old woman before me, who had shrunk to skin and bones. Who are you?" she asked. "Pip, ma'am. Mr. Pumblechook's nephew. Come to play?" I answered as respectfully as possible. Come closer. You're not afraid of a woman who's never seen the sun since you were born, are you, boy?" I shook my head to indicate that I was not, although I had grown more frightened now that I had met her. She put a hand on her chest, on the left side, and she said, "Do you know what lies under here?" Your breast, your boob, your breast, ma'am." "My heart, boy. Broken." She pronounced the word with a weird smile and somewhat boastfully. She motioned me to look at her watch, which lay on the dressing table, and a clock on the wall. Both were set to 20 minutes to 9. The hands on them had stopped moving. She nodded meaningfully at me. "I'm tired. I want to be amused. I have a sick fancy to see someone play." "Play!" I could do nothing but stand there, for I did not know how to play. She turned to look at herself in the mirror, and after a while she said patiently, "Call Estella. You can at least do that if you can't play, can't you? I say, call Estella." I went into the dark corridor and I called. Soon Estella's candle came toward me. Miss Havisham beckoned the girl to come to her. Then she picked up a jewel from the dressing table and she held it against Estella's brown hair. This jewel will be yours one day, my dear," she said with a chilling laugh. It'll help you to gain the admiration of men and to break their hearts. Now, play cards with this boy as I watch." Estella was indignant. "Play with him? He's only a common laboring boy." I overheard Miss Havisham whisper, "Even so, you can break his heart, can't you?" Estella nodded. We sat down to a game of beggar my neighbor. I could not concentrate on the cards. Estella kept up a stream of remarks to Miss Havisham. "Oh, what coarse hands he has! Oh, and what thick boots!" She laughed with disdain and added, "See how he calls the knaves by the wrong name. He calls them jacks." Now, I was so upset that I misdealt, and she called me clumsy. And of course, Estella won the game. Miss Havisham sat like a corpse as we played. After a while, she leaned forward and said to me, Estella has said many hard things about you, but you say nothing about her. What do you think of her? Tell me. Whisper to me, boy. At her insistence, I whispered in her ear.
Estella is very proud.
Is that all?
Very insulting.
Is that all?
And very, very pretty. Please, may I go home now?
Miss Havisham did not let me leave until the next game was over, but then I was dismissed and told to return in 6 days. She ordered Estella to give me some bread and some meat, and I felt as if I were a dog being fed. The hurt and the humiliations caused tears to well in my eyes. When Estella saw my reddened eyes, a smile of delight came to her face, and tossed her head. She tossed her head in contempt. My sister was nicer to me that night, for she felt that I had come up a little in the world. Yet I was miserable. I had not known before how common a person I was until Estella had pointed it out. Now I saw the thickness of my boots. I saw the coarseness of my own hands, and I saw my ignorance. Had I not called knaves jacks? I knew that I was common, and now I was ashamed of it because of the beautiful Estella. Meeting Estella had changed my life completely. 6 days later, obediently, I returned to Miss Havisham's, and again an arrogant Estella led me along the dark passageway. Miss Havisham, seated as before at her dressing table, greeted me with, "You did not play very well, boy. Are you willing to work?" At my nod, she directed me to wait for her in the dining room across the hall. Now, like her dressing room, this room also had curtains drawn against the daylight and was filled with an oppressive, airless smell. The clocks here, as in the other room, had stopped at 20 minutes to 9. The central piece of furniture was a long table with a dusty, rotting cloth spread on it as if in preparation for a feast. A tarnished silver stand that had become a home to speckled-legged spiders was in the middle of the table. Atop the stand was a yellow mound of something that was so heavy with cobwebs I could not identify its original purpose. I was so fascinated with watching several mice scuttling around the room, I did not hear Miss Havisham hobble in, leaning on a walking stick. She pointed with a stick to the yellow mound of the cobwebs and said, "As Silver has explained to you, that is my bridal cake, boy." Then putting her twitching hand on my shoulder, she ordered, "Now for your work. You will walk me around." With her leaning on my shoulder, we walked slowly around and around the room. The walk was followed by a game of cards played with Estella under Miss Havisham's piercing gaze and by another dog-like meal. Now, for 8 or 9 or more months, this was the pattern of my visits. In time, I grew less clumsy at play, but Estella was always cruel to me, finding new imperfections in me to make her laugh. Only twice was there some difference in the routine. On one occasion, a gentleman was coming down the stairs as Estella was leading me up them. He stopped and looked at me. "Well, whom do we have here?" he asked. "It's just a boy," said Estella carelessly. He was a large man with a large head. It was difficult to feel at ease, for he looked at me suspiciously under bushy black eyebrows. "Are you from the neighborhood, son?" the man asked me. "Yes, sir. I'm Pip, sir." He thought over my answer, then he waved me on. I forgot him, for at that time he was nothing to me. Now, the other incident that disturbed our routine happened when Miss Havisham made Estella and me play longer than usual at cards. Usually I made stupid moves by nervousness. This time, having longed to adjust to the card playing, I did fairly well, and Miss Havisham even praised me. This must have made an impression on Estella, for when she saw me to the gate, she turned to me and said, "Come here, boy. You may kiss me if you like." I kissed her cheek as she turned it to me. Now, until that moment, I would have given anything to kiss Estella. But she said she had spoken in the same imperious way that Miss Havisham had praised me. She was imitating the old lady, you see. She was giving a tip to a common boy who had surprisingly done something well, and I could not value such a kiss. One day, Miss Havisham remarked as she placed her arm on my shoulder for a walk, You're growing tall, Pip. Later, she asked if the blacksmith still wanted me as his apprentice. When I told her that it was Joe's dearest wish, she said, Well then, it is time for it to become fact. Let me see the papers. My sister, Joe, and Uncle Pumblechook took me to the town hall, and I was registered as Joe's apprentice, officially. When I brought the papers to Miss Havisham, she nodded in approval. She gave me the magnificent sum of 25 guineas. You've been a good boy. Here's your reward. Expect no other. You are not to come here again. Joe Gargery is your master now. When I showed the reward at home, my sister was more convinced than ever that Miss Havisham had plans for me. Uncle Pumblechook agreed and reminded us that it was through him that I had met Miss Havisham at all. Joe was in a whirl of delight that at last I was his apprentice. Once it had been my fondest hope, too. But now I dreaded facing the forge and a life as a blacksmith. With their riches and refinement, Miss Havisham and Estella had altered my ideas of what life could be. As my apprenticeship with Joe progressed, my depression over it deepened. Unlikely though it was, my worst fear now was that Estella would look in a forge window and see me with a black face and hands. Now, how she would laugh at me and despise me. I would have run away to sea, but I could not hurt Joe by doing such a contemptible thing, nor could I disillusion his belief that being a blacksmith was a fine occupation after all. Still, I managed not to show my unhappiness to Joe, for which I'm very glad. When a year had passed, I could no longer fight my desire to see Estella and Miss Havisham again. Joe was agreeable to my taking a day off from work, and soon I found myself in front of the familiar gate. It took some time for me to work up the courage to ring the bell. A woman answered the bell at the gate and introduced herself as one of Miss Havisham's cousins. I am certain that the woman would have liked to send me away, but she did not dare to do so on her own. Miss Havisham ordered me in, and I found her and everything else about the rooms unchanged. Well, she said, I hope you don't want anything, for you'll get nothing. No, Miss Havisham, I replied. I only wanted you to know that I'm doing well on my apprenticeship, and I am grateful to you for urging it. Well, if that's the case, then fine, boy. You may come to see me now and then. Come on your birthday. When she saw me looking around, she smiled slyly and added, You're wondering where Estella is, aren't you? Well, yes, ma'am, I sort of was. I was just hoping she was well. Oh, she's well, boy, and she's gone abroad. She's being educated as a lady. She's prettier than ever and much admired by all who see her. Do you feel that you have lost her, boy? She broke into malicious and disagreeable laughter when she saw the pain I was feeling expressed on my face. I didn't know how to answer her, but I didn't have to. She waved me out of the room, and I hurried down the stairs, out of the house, into the road, her laughter ringing behind me. Since I had to walk, it was night by the time I neared home. I could see at the house, and the forge were brightly lit. As I drew closer, I saw a crowd of people milling about and in front of the yard, and I started to run, and the crowd, recognizing me, parted for my entrance. A circle of people stood in the kitchen, Joe and the village doctor among them. When I burst into the room, they looked up and moved aside so I could see what had happened. My dear sister, lay on the kitchen floor, unconscious and bleeding heavily from her head. Joe put his arm around me and explained, Now, old chap, we must be brave. Some villain has crept into this very kitchen and laid out Mrs. Joe with a wicked blow. Is she alive, Joe? I gasped. The doctor spoke up. Alive, yes. She's alive. She's in her right senses, though. Well, probably not. By now the police were questioning everybody, but no one had seen the attack. Someone had come up behind her as she stood at the stove and dealt her a heavy blow on the back of her head. Though the investigation continued for weeks, the attacker was never found. Joe and I said nothing to one another, but each of us knew that my sister had made many enemies with her sharp tongue and her quick temper. I was not the only person in the village who had received a battering from her strong fists. We knew, but never said, that many people hated my sister, and that any one of them could have dealt her the blow. She was alive, But her recovery was slow. She never did regain her power of speech or her memory, and her personality was much changed. She was patient and quiet, asking with her hands only to be made warm and comfortable by the fire like an aged cat. Of course, Joe was upset by the change in Mrs. Joe, but gradually, slowly, we felt a peace in our lives that we had never experienced before. Our happiness grew when Biddy came to live with us and take care of us. Now, Biddy was an orphan girl in the village and was distantly related to Mr. Wopsle. She was wonderfully clever, and my reading and writing improved very fast under Biddy's guidance. As for her cooking, Joe and I had never tasted such delicious meals. She was gentle and kind with my sister and kept us clean and comfortable. For the first time in his life, Joe was able to go freely to the village pub for a glass of beer and conversation with the other men. I found myself confiding in Biddy, for she was sympathetic, but she also had sensible comments to make. It was to her, not to Joe, that I confided my dream. "Biddy, I want to be a gentleman," I told her one day. She looked up from her sewing and asked, "Is it because of Estella? Because she would not want you as you are?" Miserably, I nodded my agreement. I was ashamed for myself. I was ashamed for Estella. Now, in almost 4 years, I had been an apprentice to Joe when Mr. Jaggers appeared at our door. I recognized him immediately as the man that Estella and I had met on the stairs at Miss Havisham's years before. There was no mistaking those sharp, suspicious eyes and those bushy black eyebrows of Mr. Jaggers. And Mr. Jaggers spoke with great authority. "I have reason to believe that I am facing the blacksmith, Joseph Gargery, and his apprentice, Pip, is it?" "That's quite right, sir," answered Joe. "My name is Jaggers. I'm a lawyer in London. I am sent to you by one of my clients." Impressed by his grandeur of speech, Joe led the way into the parlor. I followed, snatching off the dust covers from the table, a chair, and the sofa. Mr. Jaggers sat in the chair by the table and, looking sternly at Joe, said, "I am here with an offer to relieve you of your apprenticeship, Pip." It is good to his good, Joe. Would you demand to be paid to let him go?" Well, no. I would ask nothing. I would not stand in Pip's way." Jaggers then turned to me and said, "I am here to inform you that one day you will come into property and money. The person who has made this offer wants you to be ready and able to use these gifts. To that end, you shall be educated and brought up as a gentleman, with great expectations of wealth." I caught my breath. Here was my dream come true. Miss Havisham was going to make my wild fancy a reality. Now, Mr. Pip, there are conditions to this offer. First, you must always bear the name of Pip. Second, the name of your benefactor, son, will remain a secret until that person chooses to reveal it. If you have suspicion of that person's identity, you are not to hint at it, but you are to keep silent. Is that clear, son?" I nodded. "Well, do you accept?" I nodded again. Jaggers let a few minutes pass to signify the importance of his words. He aroused himself to continue my instructions. "Now, as to the arrangements, I have said that you have great expectations for your future. For the present, a very handsome sum of money has been provided for you. It will be more than enough for your education and living expenses. I will handle the money on your behalf. You may consider me your guardian." When I tried to thank him, he held up his hand in refusal. "I'm being very well paid for my services. Now listen closely to my suggestions. You are to come to London immediately after purchasing some suitable clothes. There you will lodge with one Herbert Pocket, a young gentleman of your own age. Perhaps you will be able to pick up some of the habits and manners of a gentleman from him, and I recommend that you employ his father as your tutor. What do you have to say to all this, Pip?" Yes, of course, Mr. Jaggers. Whatever you think best. I've heard of the Pockets, for they are related to Miss Havisham." The man's face became stone-like, and he said, Yes, I believe that is so. Now, here's some money for your clothes and for the journey." He counted out 20 guineas on the table, and he added his business card to the money and said goodbye and was gone. Now Joe and I sat on the sofa, stunned. Biddy found us there, as still as two statues. When Joe came to his senses, he poured out the story of my good fortune to her. Then he ran into the kitchen to try to make my sister understand what had happened. Biddy shook my hand and heartily and said,
"So, one dream is coming true then, eh, Pip? I wonder if your other dreams will do as well."
I knew that she referred to my love for Estella, and that she thought Estella proud and unworthy of me. So I kept my reply brief and saying, "Well, who knows, Biddy, who knows?" My sister's mind was now so weak that we were never able to make her understand what had happened. She smiled and nodded, pleased at the extra attention she was getting, though. Early the next morning, I went to Mr. Trabb's tailor shop in our village. When his boy told me that the tailor was still at breakfast in his apartment behind the shop, I waited impatiently until Mr. Trabb called me to his table. He did not think it was worth his while to interrupt his meal and come out to me, nor did he offer me anything to eat as I stood before him. "Mr. Trabb," I said while we ate, "I have come into some money." At that, the tailor stiffened. He put down his buttered roll, he wiped his fingers, and he rose from his chair. His eyes widened as I took some guineas from my pocket. "I am leaving for London soon," I explained. "I want a fashionable suit to wear on the journey, you see." Mr. Trabb then swept me into his shop and started a flurry of activity. He ordered his boy to lift bolts of cloth from the shelves. Mr. Trabb unfurled each bolt himself, praising the cloth, extolling the virtues of each one. With his assistance, I selected one fit for a young gentleman. I stood still as he measured me, all the while assuring me that my proportions would make any suit look distinguished. He even opened the door for me himself when I left. The fitting was my first encounter with the enormous power of money. When the suit was ready, I wore it to Miss Havisham's when I went to say goodbye. She told me that she knew of my good fortune from Mr. Jaggers, and she wished me well before waving me off. I wanted to thank her, but I remembered Mr. Jaggers' conditions and did not reveal that I believed her to be my benefactor. Her last words to me were, "Goodbye, Pip. You will always keep the name of Pip, you know." Unable to respond to her mysterious farewell, I nodded. I waved, and I quickly walked away. As the day neared for my departure, Joe grew more solemn. "It's not my apprentice that's being took from me, you know, but a little child that sat with me many a night by the fire and watched me many a day at the forge." He was no longer able to contain his feelings. I turned away from him in tears, for I was so eager to leave, so eager for my great expectations to become a reality. God forgive me, I'd forsaken my dearest friend Joe. My new life. I made the journey to London in a 4-horse stagecoach in about 5 hours. I would have been frightened at being in such a big city, except I found it dirty and full of ugly, narrow, crooked streets. I went at once to Mick's office. That's Mr. Jaggers' office. He told me what my allowance was to be, a sum that seemed enormous to me. He also gave me business cards of tailors and other tradesmen from whom I could buy on credit, with the bills being sent to Mr. Jaggers. This would be a convenience to me. Yes, but would also allow Mr. Jaggers to keep track of my spending. He then ordered his clerk, Mr. Wemmick, to guide me to the rooms that I was to share with young Herbert Pocket. Mr. Wemmick was a short, dry man, but his eyes were keen and glittering. He led me to Barnard's Inn, a collection of buildings built around a courtyard. We passed through a gate. We entered one of the buildings and walked upstairs to rooms on the top floor. A note stuck over the mailbox announced, "Back soon." Since the door was not locked, we went in. Well, you won't be needing me any more, but since I'm in charge of your cash box for Mr. Jaggers, no doubt we will meet often. Yes. After I thanked him and he left, I looked at the rooms that were to be my new home. They were large enough and seemed even larger. They had little furniture in them. Also, they were not very clean. But then, well, they belonged to a bachelor, didn't they? After a little while, I heard footsteps in the hall. A pale young man then entered, carrying a container of strawberries. Half out of breath, he smiled widely and asked, "Are you Pip? Are you Mr. Pip?" I gave him a smile back with my reply. Yes, Mr. Pocket. Oh, 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 Mr. Pip, I'm sorry I was out upon your arrival, but I was not sure what time the stage got in. It occurred to me that you might like some fresh fruit with your dinner, so I dashed out to get some. Now this was the first example that I had of Herbert's kindness. He scarcely heard my thanks, for he was rattling on about our living arrangements. The coffee house in the next building supplied our meals. I paid for both of us by Mr. Jagger's arrangement. And although he was a gentleman, well, Herbert was poor. He confessed his situation in so cheerful and frank a manner that I liked him all the more for it. He was poorly paid in his banking job, and this accounted for the sparse furnishings. By the time that I unpacked, a waiter had brought up a delicious dinner of chicken, melted butter, cheese, and crusty bread. Perhaps it seemed to me better than it was, because now I was independent, and I was in London. Now I did not know if Jaggers or Miss Havisham, to whom he was related, had told Herbert my story. I wanted him to hear it all, so I spent the next hour giving him the details. I finished by asking him to correct my manners and to show me proper London ways. In exchange, we dined, and Herbert told me Miss Havisham's story. Oh, you see, her mother died when she was small, and her father spoiled her. He left her a fortune, don't you know? By the way, Pip, in London it's not customary to put the knife in the mouth, you see. The fork is used for that purpose. He corrected me in such a lively manner that I hardly blushed, but rather thanked him. Miss Havisham, you see, fell in love with a handsome man whom my father distrusted. She gave him enormous sums of money during their engagement. On their wedding day, he sent Miss Havisham a letter breaking off the marriage. She received it at— And here I interrupted. At 20 minutes to 9, when she was dressing. Exactly, Pip. She stopped all the clocks, and everything in the house was kept untouched to this day. A small matter, dear Pip, but it's not necessary to empty your wine glass so deeply that it rests on your nose, you see. I put my glass down, and I thanked him again for his correction. And then I asked, so why didn't he marry Miss Havisham and in that way control her money? No one knows, Pip, but we think that he was already married, you see. If he had been married, then he was false to her the entire time, and he had never really loved her. I shook my head. Oh, poor Miss Havisham. My poor benefactor. Now, the next day, Herbert took the time from his job to bring me to his father's house. His father, my tutor, had gray hair, but his face was youthful. His smile and natural manner were very like Herbert's. I liked him at once. I was to receive my lessons with 2 other students. Startop was friendly and good-natured, but Bentley, Drummle, and I disliked one another on sight. Later I found that Drummle disliked almost everyone because he considered himself too good for ordinary company. He was related to the aristocracy, you see, but his manner was sulky and rude. As I reported to Herbert, Drummle reminded me of a large spider and was just about as pleasant. Me, I kind of like spiders, but still. Mr. Pocket began at once on my education, which included famous sites and places that I must visit in London. One day, as I sat looking around my rather depressing rooms at Bernard's Inn, I realized that they did not have to look as they did. I resolved to surprise Herbert with new furniture, rugs, and curtains. When I told Mr. Jaggers of my plan, he laughed. I knew it would take no time at all for you before you caught on to city life. How much money do you need? As I was considering the sum, Mr. Jagger's housekeeper arrived with a hot lunch for him. She was a tall woman, about 40 years old, with large faded eyes. She kept her eyes on Mr. Jaggers as if pleading for something. I could see that the lunch was a fine one indeed. Finally, I named a sum, and Mick, Mr. Jaggers, called Mr. Wemmick in and instructed him to count out the money for me. Herbert was delighted with the splendid appearance of our rooms after my bit of redecorating, and shook my hand several times a day for the next week to express the pleasure that he took in them. The change was no sooner accomplished than I learned I was to have a visitor, one who would be unable to distinguish between my oriental rug and the ugly carpet in my sister's house. Biddy had written that Joe was set on visiting me, and my return letter confirmed the day. In truth, I did not want to see Joe. If I could have paid the dear man to stay away, I would have done so. But how? How could I tell him that I was no longer the Pip he had once known? On the appointed day, I heard Joe clump up the stairs. When he reached my door, I thought he would never finish wiping his feet. I was about to lift him bodily off the mat, but at last he came in. With his face aglow, he seized my hands and worked them straight up and down as if I were some new kind of pump. I offered to take Joe's hat, which I saw was new, but Joe kept a hold of it as if it were precious. His eyes took in the room and the flowered pattern on my dressing gown. Joe was nearly tongue-tied by the splendor of them. I was glad when Herbert came in, followed by a waiter who set out our meal. Before we sat down at the table, Joe relinquished his hat. He placed it on the corner of the mantel above the fireplace, from which it fell at intervals. "So, will you have some coffee or tea, Mr. Gargery?" asked Herbert, ready to pour out either. Thank you, sir," Joe replied, stiff from head to foot. "I'll take whichever is most agreeable to yourself." "Well, what do you say to coffee, then?" "Oh, thank you, sir. Since you're so kind as to make the choice coffee, I will not go contrary to your opinion, but don't you ever find it heats one up a bit?" "It'll be tea, then," said Herbert, and he poured it out. Here Joe's hat tumbled off the mantel. He leaped to pick it up and return it to the exact same spot. As he ate, Joe fell into unaccountable fits of meditation with his fork midway between his plate and his mouth. He coughed strangely, and he sat so far from the table he dropped more food than he ate. I was glad when Herbert left us. Of course, the strain was my fault. If I had been more relaxed with Joe, he would have been more relaxed with me. Us two be alone now, sir," he began. "Please, Joe, how can you call me sir?" Self-consciously, Joe looked down and began again. "I was wrong to come here, Pip. I'm wrong in these clothes. I belong in the forge, on the marshes. I know I'm awful dull, Pip, but if you should ever want to see your old Joe, you come home, you put your head in the old forge window like you used to, right? Now, goodbye, dear old Pip. God bless you." And he left. For several weeks afterwards, I was full of shame at myself over Joe's visit. Even more so when I received the news that my sister had died. I must admit I felt only a kind of relief at her passing. No, it was not until years later, when I was 20, that I received good news from the past. I learned through Mr. Jaggers that Estella had just returned from France, and she was coming to live in London, where she invited me to call upon her.